This workshop is on a blending of ideas which reflect the structure of its organizing group. So the focus is on innovations, and I emphasize that innovations in the field of development finance, not so much on just the specifics of the innovative flows themselves, although there's elements of that, but in particular on the ways in which the changing patterns of development finance generating important new questions and ideas of governance and the difference in which those forms of governance can make. And trying to situate all of that, of course, in the wider context of the purposes of development finance, that is the development end of it and the experience of the people who are perhaps made better off, environmental situations which are improved and so forth through the development enterprise. But the angle, of course, rather than try to address all of that waterfront, is a little more specific to this intersection. So I'm Benedict Kingsbury. I'm the director of the Institute for International Law and Justice here at NYU, and we're super pleased to be working with this group from Gießen, directed by Philipp, Dann, who's here, and 4 of his doctoral students are here also. The financial support for this comes from the grant that they have from the Volkswagen Stiftung, from Volkswagen, also from the NYU Law School and the IILJ, so we're very grateful at our end also to our Dean, Ricky Revesz, just about to step down for the long-standing support he's given to the IILJ. Davinia Aziz has done a tremendous job on the logistics. Many of you will have dealt with her, and that's her sitting over there. So many of you will deal with her again. And also, she's worked with, she's a fellow in the IILJ, lawyer from Singapore. She's worked with Angelina Fisher, our program director, who's a lawyer from Canada. In the Gießen end, Ms. Schultz has helped with a lot of the practical elements, especially of travel for people coming from afar. We have 3 student rapporteurs here. One of the real joys of being in NYU is the outstanding quality of the students. And our 3 rapporteurs, they'll be taking notes furiously. I don't actually mean angrily, although they may be angry, but I mean vigorously but between them. And that is Melinda Marley, who should be there, from Canada, May Miller-Dawkins from there, and still coming, I think, from whichever class she has now, as Meza from Indonesia. So that's those 3. Please have a chat with them. We also have quite a bunch of our students and even some prospective students of NYU will be here in and out during the day and a half. So if you're famous and important, please make a point to chat to students who will be famous and important in the future. So it's really nice if we can have a real intellectual community, so chat with everybody. So the flow of the workshop, I think you get a pretty good sense of it from the program. We are starting in this first session with 3 big picture perspectives on fundamental themes in the workshop as a whole. And we then move through the discussions of things specific to the World Bank and innovation and development finance in and around that, and some specific topics to the Knowledge Bank, fragile states. We address the kind of fundamental questions of corruption and rule of law in this context. We look at what's going on in sovereign lending, sovereign debt, structures for that, getting the money back and so forth, governance elements of that. We move to look at private philanthropic type mission-based flows in the last part of today. Tomorrow morning we look at new financial sources from China and India in particular, and the experiences of those in Africa. And then we try, as in most of our work here, to then look at what's happening within countries, within recipient countries in particular, with a focus especially on public-private partnerships, but also other innovative approaches being taken, and particularly addressing Latin America, Brazil, and Indonesia. So that's the big picture of this. This work, of course, has a lot of connections with overall patterns of interinstitutional interactions, which is a separate project we have here at the IILJ, and we thought we'd take advantage of having so much talent gathered here with this focus on broadly on development issues, to have a whole workshop on that, but very much in a roundtable form, and that'll be a Tuesday afternoon. So everyone who's here is very welcome to that. Many people are organised to take part in it already, but that'll be also up on this floor, probably in the next door room if we don't have as many people, otherwise in here, Tuesday afternoon from 2 o'clock until 5:40 on the theme of relations between institutions and global governance with this kind of focus. With that, we can move to our organised part of this morning's first session, and we start with Annalisa Prizzon from the ODI, who's going to address really the way in which development finance is moving now, the implications of that for the post-2015, post-MDGs dynamics, and the implications for partner countries. So with that, Annalisa.
Should I speak from here?
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the meantime, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation and also for the daunting task of kicking off the workshop. So I've been asked, as Benedict was mentioning, to provide a sort of overview of the development finance landscape and how it's evolved in the last 10 years and how it's going to look like in the future. And in a sense, this is the bread and butter of the program of work of my unit at the Overseas Development Institute, a think tank based in London. And the idea really would be to present, seems probably better here, to provide a sort of macro picture of the trends in development finance. So it's going to be a relatively light touch. I'm aware that most of you might be already aware of most of these topics, but it's like to bring together all the different pieces of the picture that will be further developed during the workshop. So without further ado, I would like to start actually with a question to you all. If any of you might guess which country in September 2012 has issued Eurobonds that went oversubscribed by 24 times with a decent coupon of 5%. This is a country, I have to say, I wouldn't have guessed it wouldn't be able to do so 10 years ago. Any of you has an idea which country might be? Any guess? Well, I was there actually when it happened, and this is Zambia. And this is just to give you an anecdote of how things are changing quite rapidly. I wouldn't have expected 10 years ago Zambia to be able to access international financial markets. It means there are more options, more opportunities, what Philipp will present later today about the age of choice. This is a program of work at ODI. More options, more opportunities that we kind of understood it's quite a positive achievement for these countries. And Zambia was the most indebted countries 20 years ago on per capita level with sluggish growth. So this is not just an anecdote. It can be extended to a large number of countries nowadays. So how has the development finance landscape changed over the last 10 years? Basically, we're looking here at 4 different drivers. We were looking into how the macroeconomic context has changed, how actors have evolved, new actors, how new instruments have been introduced, and how motives have changed over the last 10 years. For instance, when the MDGs have been settled 10 years ago or so. So, first of all, I'm not saying anything new to any of you. Emerging and developing economies have been driving global growth in the last 10 years. They've been, for instance, attracted more FDI than developed countries in 2010. And most of the developing countries are in better shape when it comes to fiscal position. They have, on average, more fiscal space. Of course, expansion of the tax base for these countries, as well as they've been characterized by lower debt service. And some countries have also expressed a clear strategy to end aid dependency. This is the case of Rwanda, of Liberia. They would like in the medium term to exit official development assistance. It's quite difficult to understand whether it's just a kind of demand-driven point in the sense that it's a kind of general desire and strategy of the countries, or if it's a kind of result of the credit crunch and the cut in official development assistance. This is not necessarily a kind of macroeconomic poorly kind of point, but I just wanted to stress, as most of you might be familiar, I mean, there have been impressive changes and improvements in ICT, and in particular in the way, for instance, private giving is managed. I might be able, for instance, to finance a loan directly to a project in Cambodia, and I'm myself an M-Pesa customer. M-Pesa is a transaction system in Kenya. I have to say, when I was there a month ago, my local team was anytime busy to type on their mobile phone, and they were making financial transactions, basically. So something still that was unexpected 10 years ago. Looking into the actors, I used the new with quotes and quotes. I mean, some of these actors have been there for decades, and I'm talking about especially about official donors that are not members of the Development Assistance Committee, which is a group of rich countries based at the OECD in Paris, defining in very broad terms the kind of principles of aid delivery. And I'm saying new because they've changed their delivery mode from purely technical assistance to financial assistance, so they became more visible. I'm talking also about philanthropic organizations. They kind of moved from a purely domestic grant making towards international grant making. I'm just citing the Gates Foundation, Rockefeller. Also, the private sector has been much more involved in development assistance, in their not-for-profit mode, and I'm talking about examples of social impact investment. We might want to talk a bit more later on. Then I mentioned also vertical health funds. That's the Global Fund for the fight against AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, and the Global Alliance for Vaccine and Immunization. They're largely financed by traditional donors, but they are innovative in the way they fundraise, and in particular how they deliver development assistance, which is kind of rather separate from the traditional donors. And the final actor that kind of expanded their role, I'm talking about development finance institutions. These are, for instance, the European Investment Bank, KfW, the German private wing of development cooperation. And this is a kind of an area and a clear strategy for most of the traditional donors to expand their private wing. And in particular, the development of blended financial instruments, so a grant element combined with a concessional loan. Then I'm talking about, in terms of the new development finance, about new motives. I mean, 10 years ago, climate finance was only embryonic. Now there are commitments by 2020 of roughly 100 billion per year. We're still talking about commitment and not disbursement. And there are other motives linked to financing of global public goods. I'm talking about health, food security, security itself. And there are also new and innovative instruments. I was mentioning before the person-to-person giving, and as an example by Kiva, it's an organization that kind of facilitates person-to-person loans. And this is a kind of clear what my colleague Andrew Rogers and Hobby Karas talk about in their paper Horizon 2025 about disintermediation of private giving. And then there are also other kind of more innovative finance instruments like the International Finance Facility for Immunization Initiative as a front-load instrument to finance research, and the Global Currency Transaction Tax, just to name a couple of them. It's quite difficult to judge their kind of relative magnitude. They're still relatively small, and it's quite uncertain to understand how they're going to look like. They've been innovative for a decade or so, so we might want to discuss later on about that. I would like to kind of show you very briefly the kind of map between source actors in development assistance, channels, and recipients. I won't go into detail, it's a quite complicated graph, but I just wanted to show you the kind of different complexity between the traditional flows of development assistance with the non-traditional ones. So here I'm describing the different interlinkages between actors involved in traditional development assistance. I'm talking about assistance that is managed through the traditional lenses of the Development Assistance Committee. And it basically consists of multilateral and bilateral cooperation. But then, when it comes to the kind of relationships for non-traditional development assistance, now we end up having a spaghetti bowl. So we don't have a relative magnitude here. I'm not going into detail, but it's just to show you how the management of development assistance has become extremely complex in the last 10 years. And in particular, I would like to flag that this kind of actors and channels are interconnected between each other. For instance, philanthropic organizations, foundations do finance civil society organizations, vertical health funds, social impact investments. So it's important to stress the complexity of the new development finance landscape. But now let's talk about money and about actual flows. A first point I would like to make, and I partially summarized that in the paper the background paper for the conference. First of all, the most important source of development finance to finance development strategies in emerging and developing economies was and will continue to be taxation. So basically, general government revenues in developing countries, as I was mentioning in the macroeconomic context, has increased by more than 4 times in the last 10 years. I'm not going into numbers, but still the IMF estimates in their forecasting models that this trend is likely to continue, and this kind of reflecting the growth performance in these countries. It is the largest source of development finance for both the middle-income and low-income countries. Low-income countries are countries that have a per capita income roughly of $1,000 per year. But the picture is rather different in terms of relative magnitudes. While in middle-income countries, ODA, which is the second bar, is relatively minor, still for low-income countries, ODA as a share of GDP is more or less as important as taxation. So when we're talking about the new challenges for official development assistance in a few minutes, we must kind of take into account who is the recipient of this form of assistance. So let's now talk again about numbers. And now we'll try to focus on development assistance only. In 2000, official development assistance provided by direct donors was roughly 80 billion. And the philanthropic assistance, this is based only on US philanthropic organizations, was absolutely minor compared to it, $3 billion US. And I don't have any comparable information when it comes to non-direct donors. This is particularly difficult to track all the equivalent flows from countries that are not members of the official Development Assistance Committee. But the picture changes, as I was mentioning, in 2010. So while official development assistance has expanded up to $130 billion, philanthropic assistance has skyrocketed. It's a matter of tracking flows, and this is still US-based only. So from $3 billion US up to roughly $60 billion US. So it's roughly half of the total ODA flows. And there's still more to come because European philanthropic organizations are not tracked. And another important point is around assistance from donors that are not members of the Development Assistance Committee. So from flows that weren't tracked in 2000, now we're talking about roughly $15 billion US. Now, shifting a bit from numbers into kind of policy trends, what has changed so to speak, in the last few years in the way official development assistance is delivered. Of course, there are impacts linked to the credit crunch and fiscal tightening in DAC countries. The DAC has released also ODA figures last week, and they're still declining by 4%. So, and this kind of generated a few trends that will be discussed later on in the conference. First of all, there's a kind of strong focus in making, in a sense, ODA delivery more accountable to taxpayers. So a stress on results and on value for money, getting the most out of development assistance that is delivered. And the kind of interlinked point is about the stress of having transparent numbers. There's been an initiative called the ITI that pushed for members of the Development Assistance Committee to publish in more detail the commitments, as well as from other philanthropic organizations, including the Gates Foundation. We can also mention greater risk aversion by DAC donors, in the sense that they are kind of phasing out or trying to reduce the share, for instance, spent on budget support. This is coming from DFID, for instance, but also by the European Union, still in the sense to be more accountable to taxpayers. The other point we kind of seen in the last few years, it's a greater focus towards support to the private sector. In the sense, official development assistance should kind of help as a catalyzer of other flows of development finance to support private sector development. And this is very much linked to the kind of example I made before on blended finance. And finally, the other trend that we have seen, and it's a big debate actually in organizations like ODI and other organizations working in the UK, is about country selectivity. Donors are seeing many developing countries graduating into middle income status, and one example is Zambia, as I mentioned at the beginning, and they're kind of reconsidering if they still need aid. And for instance, in the case of UK assistance, they reconsidered their development assistance flows to India, and India is not receiving any longer grants, but only loans. So these are important trends shaping the way development assistance is delivered. Just a very kind of quick point on the characteristics of South-South cooperation. And by South-South cooperation, I'm talking about assistance provided by the BRICS. Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and to a certain extent by Russia. The principle guiding official development assistance from South-South cooperation do not overlap with the Paris Declaration principles. They are the kind of principles for DAC donors in the way they should deliver assistance. And these are particular in the case of South-South cooperation, is mutual benefit and reciprocity, in the sense that should be kind of benefit both countries, and it's not just kind of directed to reduce poverty, and this is normally the ultimate aim of donor countries within the DAC. And in particular, the kind of element of solidarity, which is a kind of probably at the backbone of South-South cooperation and non-interference in national politics. And the other point about South-South cooperation is the greater focus on technical assistance. So, for instance, in the case of Brazil, there's a particular kind of learning process in terms, for instance, on agriculture, on social protection, leveraging, for instance, on the kind of extremely positive experience of social protection policies as the Bolsa Familia, on conditional cash transfers. And the other particular point on South-South cooperation is the focus on infrastructure and growth, so to speak, sectors, while traditional donors are more focused on social sector as part of the heritage of the MDGs. And now let's move to the kind of last point, how the landscape is going to look like. So these are a kind of few guesses that are also included in the background paper. So first of all, I said taxation, government revenues are and will be the kind of largest source of development finance, or at least the largest source to support development strategies in developing countries. Not only taxation, but also this could be achieved through financial deepening. The other point is that at least for middle-income countries, private cross-border flows are much more important than official development assistance. And this is particularly important when we're discussing the kind of the lower importance of ODA in the years to come. When it comes to non-DAC donors, I mentioned their financial assistance has been growing. We're talking about roughly 15 billion US dollar in 2010. And we're thinking they're going to expand as they're going to expand also the kind of role in global politics. And they're also an important source of knowledge transfer. Estimates from the Brookings Institute actually said that if non-DAC G20 member countries devoted roughly 0.15% of their GDP in 2020, they will achieve roughly 15 billion of development assistance, which is actually 20% of the total envelope of the traditional DAC donors. So it's going to be still quite important in the years to come. ODA mentioned they're still under threat. I mean, we've seen a kind of 4% decrease this year. Even though the kind of statistics by the DAC and the kind of forwarding plan said that there's going to be a kind of rise in 2013. And they said actually that the largest focus is going to be in middle-income countries, which is quite strange, actually. I mean, if I thinking when I started kind of considering this paper, I was thinking that the focus would have been in the poorest countries, in the fragile countries. And there's a motivation why there might be a shift towards middle-income countries because instruments might change. There's a shift from grants to soft loans. So still kind of moving into making official development assistance kind of accountable to taxpayers. And the other kind of big trends we kind of envisage will be a kind of shift towards global public goods, and in particular climate finance. I have to say that it's still particularly difficult at the moment to understand how much ODA is spent for climate finance, and still something that, as my team at ODI will kind of explore in the next month, hopefully. Philanthropic assistance. We've seen that philanthropic assistance has grown from 3 billion US dollar in 2000 up to roughly 60 billion in 2010. And still, European philanthropic organizations haven't been monitored or in a systematic way, and we don't have information also about foundations in developing countries themselves. So some colleagues are arguing that might be an important source of development finance in the years to come. And still, philanthropic assistance sometimes undertake more riskier projects than development assistance. So, for instance, in financing research, vaccine and immunization programs. So, and they also kind of are more innovative in the way they leverage on the private sector. As I was mentioning before, there should be also kind of an expansion in person-to-person giving and a kind of a further push towards a disintermediation of private giving. We're talking at the moment about really negligible amounts, roughly 30 million US dollar per year, but they're on a very kind of steep path, I have to say, in the last months or so. Regarding innovative financing mechanisms, I talked about before about the IFI, about global transaction tax, but their amounts are still kind of relative minors. I mean, there are World Bank estimates in a 2009 paper talking about roughly 50 billion US dollar over the last decade, achieving roughly 12 billion in 2009. And we're talking about roughly 10% of total ODA. It's still kind of a minor, a relative minor amount. And I understand there's also kind of scope to investigate a bit more this kind of potential resources to tap funding where ODA is under threat. But still, it's still unclear how the envelope is going to look like in the years to come. So that's a kind of general overview, quite macro level, but I hope there will be further discussion later on. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Annalisa, for that excellent sketch of the landscape and the forward-looking implications of it. That's exactly what we hope to get to start our enterprise. We turn now to present a few perspectives from the side of the three of us who try to bring this enterprise together. Of course, we move now very much to the voice of law and think about governance. So Philipp Dann is going to be the primary presenter of this. He's a public lawyer and has really been a leading figure in trying to bring thinking on public law to bear on development finance in terms of its international governance implications. So he'll be the primary speaker now, and then after him, Kevin Davis will add a little bit. Kevin is a commercial lawyer and very much in the field also of law and development, and what you'll hear from his voice that he brings much more the perspective of the private lawyer into this enterprise. So we'll get at least two parts of either a choir or a cacophony, starting with Philipp.
Okay, thank you very much, Benedict, and also thank you very much, Annalisa, for this really very rich and extremely helpful introduction, I think, to get the empirical basis here. I'm not quite sure whether I'm the main speaker now. I think Kevin and I will try to sort of break this up in two even parts. What Kevin will do is to elaborate a little bit on our concept note and on the basic questions that we have raised there, especially with regard to innovation in development finance. And before Kevin basically zooms in on our concrete themes, here I would like to very briefly try to sketch out a little bit of the context of our endeavor here and try to locate the topic of development finance in the slightly broader landscape of development studies, and in particular of development studies in the law. Now, I would say that law of development finance is not really an already and well-established field. If you just look around, you wouldn't find many books with the title The Law of Development Finance. You would also hardly, the exception being the NYU, find a course taught at law school saying law and development finance. So it's something which is a little bit sort of on the fringe yet. And so what we are doing here, at least to my perspective, is to some extent a groundbreaking exercise. It's the attempt to charter a new field and to also create new avenues and perspectives on this field that we are sort of discussing here. But how is this new field or our approach different to what came before? And I want to sort of outline a little bit of that now briefly. So I think if we look at how development and law has been studied so far, you can very broadly distinguish two main approaches. Both of them ask how the law can be used to aim for development, but they are looking at different sources. They are distinguished by different sources of the law they're analyzing. One is the analysis of domestic law in developing countries. So here people ask to what extent is domestic law in developing countries used to actually further developmental aims. And central instruments here can be legal transfer, can be law reform, and the like. And this approach you all know and you are all familiar with under the title of law and development. And the law and development movement, which started in the 1950s and 60s, went through a crisis in the 1970s and 80s and has researched and has a kind of renaissance since the 1990s and since the World Bank and other development agencies rediscovered the importance of law for development processes. And David Trubeck, who will be with us here today, is actually one of the leading voices and critical voices of this approach. So this is, yeah, hi Dave. So this is one approach which I would sort of single out as the law and development movement, which is mainly focusing on domestic law in developing countries and legal transfer in this regard. Now the other approach comes from the international law perspective. So it asks to what extent international law in general and in specific fields can pay attention to the role of developing countries and further developmental aims. This can be in environmental law, this can be in trade law, intellectual property law, climate change. And here very often the discussion evolves around the instrument of a duality of norms. And this approach again started already in the 1950s, 60s, and was mainly started in the beginning by French and French-speaking authors, such as Michel Virali, Mohamed Bejawi, or Georges Abissab. So there is a certain development, droit international du développement, which sort of from which it grew out, which of course by now has become a much broader field. Now, having sort of set the sort of scene with these two main approaches, I would say something new happened in the 1990s, and this is where we come in and the law or development finance as such. And I would call it the institutional turn in development studies. And with this institutional turn, I think the sort of focus shifted away from development as such to more of the sources and instruments with which development processes are furthered, or to the delivery of aid and the actors involved here, or shortly on the governance of development processes. And here this shift we can observe in different disciplines. I would say it probably started in economics. So you see institutional economics started investigating development in the 90s, for example, by analyzing incentive structures in development agencies or failures of compliance with structural adjustment loans. So there's a new interest here to just look more closely at the institutional side and the instrumental side of this. You can also observe this in the political science, where much more attention has been paid to the institutions of the development scenery and power structures there. And obviously you can connect this shift, this institutional turn, to the much larger debate on governance and global governance. And this is something which then played out in the development scene. Now this institutional turn is also reaching the law, and this is where we are, and this is also perhaps not by accident happening in New York and the birthplace of Gall. So there is a connection, I think, between the larger sort of shift also in legal studies of global administrative law, the structures of global governance, and what we are doing here. So also with this shift, a new interest arose in sort of the governance and the law of development assistance, in the actors, in the instruments, in the procedures. Here we are asking, for example, whether there are different rules for different sources and different providers of funding, public, private, hybrid. We can ask sort of to what extent old donors and new donors play by different rules or by the same rules. We ask about which instruments are best to achieve effectiveness of transfer or to prevent corruption. So these are all questions which are now sort of much more in the focus than they had been before, let's say, 10 years ago. Let me stress, however, that this is a shift in perspective across the disciplines. And so in some extent, this is what we are trying is an inclusive approach. So it's not just a legal approach. And also, as you know, this conference tries to bring in the different perspectives from the political science, from the law, from the economics, to sort of sketch out this field. It's also not clearly set apart from the approaches which I mentioned in the beginning. So there's an overlap to the law development and the international development law kind of exercise. So in this sense, I don't want to sort of safeguard this, but it's basically like I would describe it more as an inclusive attempt to shift attention to the governance of law and finance. So I think to my or our extent, the hope for this common workshop here is also to grasp better how this third area, this governance of development finance, can be approached from different perspectives and can be thought through, and what kind of contours and questions we can raise here. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and welcome to NYU for all of you. So as Philipp said, what we had in mind here was to focus on, of course, the institutions that govern development finance, the institutions that govern the relationships between the different links in the chain that serve to channel finance from, say, taxpayers or donors or investors in one country to or for the benefit of developing countries. But we actually wanted to take a particular slant on this issue and to focus not on the institutions in general, but on the phenomenon of institutional innovation. Now, Martin Eifert may have comments on our use of the term or the concept of innovation, but in my view, innovation means not just institutional change and not just novel institutional change, but novel changes that, or changes that introduce novelty that are somehow capable of being replicated across contexts. So across different financial institutions, across different countries, across, yeah, that kind of thing, right? So that's the idea, potentially replicable changes in institutions. And the premise, or the hypothesis, I guess, of this workshop is that this kind of institutional change or innovation is both a distinctive phenomenon and one that can be analyzed using distinctive analytical tools. So my role for the next 5 minutes or so is just to map out some of the types of inquiries that we think can be made in this area. So, at least by academics and informed practitioners. So I think one mode of analysis is the kind that Annalisa has so ably demonstrated, descriptive. Right, just mapping out the field, mapping out both the sources and the types of innovation and describing or trying to ascertain their relative significance and prevalence. Right? So that's one thing that we can do, and I hope we can do more on that front. A second thing we can do is to describe potential innovations, right? Actually propose innovations. So for instance, Devesh Kapoor's paper that he'll be presenting in the next few hours actually does that. We didn't explicitly call for that kind of thing because it's always hard to sort of induce creativity, but we're very glad that there have been some examples of that kind of work here as well. What we're certainly expecting, though, was yet another kind of analysis, which is explanatory analysis, analysis of the causes of various kinds of innovation, and not just the creation of the innovations, but also their diffusion, their replication across contexts. So, borrowing from some of the literature on innovation in more physical forms of technology as opposed to institutional technologies, you could imagine changes on the demand side, changes that influence the value of innovation. Annalisa's pointed to some of those kinds of changes, just changes in the broader demand for finance based on shifts in the distribution of wealth across the globe. Those could enhance the value of innovation. So if there's a demand for climate finance, that will enhance the value of innovations that enable climate finance, for example. Another kind of shock or event that could change the demand for innovation is just a change in information, change in our perceptions of the value of information. I think this happened with the publication of the Burnside and Dollar paper at the end of the last century, suggesting the value of selectivity in aid, right? And that led to perception that there was more value to be had from modes of delivering aid that were more selective, and then thus we have the MCC, or information again about the significance of climate change. Right? Another factor, which is perhaps more endogenous, is competition. Right? Competition, as we know from manufacturing contexts, can prompt innovation in some circumstances. It can lead to a situation where you either innovate or die. That may be the case of the World Bank, right, for example. In other situations, competition, a competitive scenario can lead to an interest on the part of new entrants in just signaling their arrival and signaling their innovativeness. So new donors may want to innovate not because of the economic value or the sort of practical or instrumental value of the innovations, but just to signal that they're the new kids on the block, right, that they're doing things a different way, right. Arguably, that's happening with some of the new donors. In the sovereign debt context, Anna Gelperin has a paper with Mitu Gulati suggesting that that was what led to the adoption of collective action clauses by Mexico. They just wanted to signal their arrival and their significance in the sovereign debt world, etc. On the supply side, there's also work that can be done to try to explain changes in the costs of delivering innovation as sources of or explanations for innovation. So it could be cumulative innovation. I'm particularly interested in the extent to which advances in the theory of corporate finance might explain what we're seeing in the development finance context. So in the aftermath of Modigliani and Miller, suggesting that the terms, the design of financial instruments can help to mitigate problems of asymmetric information or collective action problems or risk aversion, right? You might see those kinds of theoretical advances in turn prompting innovation in not only corporate finance, but development finance. Or at the more applied level, we might see instruments used in the corporate setting spilling over into the development setting, right? Again, like collective action clauses or contingent capital types of mechanisms. Moving away from that, also on the supply side, technology, right? This is obviously a factor that has enabled the kind of disintermediation that Annalisa was describing with either Kiva or M-Pesa, or regulatory changes. So part of the reason why Kiva is able to operate is because it is exempt from the US securities laws, right? So it doesn't have to comply with US securities laws when it essentially issues these claims to all the Kiva lenders. That's not necessarily a regulatory change, but an enabling factor, right? And there could be other types of regulation, both like internal rules of the World Bank, say, on its open data policy, that might in turn explain subsequent rounds of innovation. On the diffusion side, we should be thinking about things like network effects or learning externalities that explain why particular innovations spread. So does the fact that a lot of people are using a particular instrument explain its popularity? Will that lead to its accelerating adoption? Or the fact that they've used it in the past and are comfortable drafting it and evaluating it, will that mean that, is that a factor that explains the adoption of different types of instruments, or social networks for that matter, right? So there's as you can tell, I'm drawing on some of the literature and the theories and the concepts that have been used in analyzing explanations of innovation in other contexts in relation to physical technology, and suggesting that they could apply in the kinds of contexts that we're going to be talking about over the next day and a half. Okay, so leaving aside the explanatory mode of analysis, I think there's also obviously room for analysis of the impact of innovations, right? And there's a lot of interest in results, and so I think there'll be that should be a focus of analysis. But I actually find it very difficult to separate the question of, well, what impacts should we be monitoring, or how to monitor the impacts, from the question of which ones should we be focusing on. And then that leads me to the normative questions, right? How do we evaluate innovations? What makes an innovation worthwhile? And here, I think, is where we will hear from some of our German colleagues in particular who've been working with Philipp, who will suggest that, well, we should evaluate these innovations using legal criteria, for instance. Criteria drawn from the law of sort of either global administrative law, international public law, whatever, the contracts that the parties have signed. So that's one approach. Philosophers might take a somewhat different approach and look at these innovations in terms of their compatibility with development or legitimacy. I think the field is quite open, right? So I think that's really the kind of work that we're hoping will come out of this conference. Obviously, we're also, as lawyers, particularly interested in the role that law plays in all of this. On the descriptive side, of course, we're interested in innovations that involve innovations in law, in the design of legal instruments, right? And we'll hear a lot about that. We're also interested in the extent to which law plays a causal role as an explanatory factor, like perhaps in the case of Kiva or open data policies and so forth. And then, as I mentioned at the end, in the normative analysis, law might be a source of criteria for evaluating innovations. And again, I suspect we'll hear a lot more about that. So that's my take on what I'm hoping for, based on my review of the papers we've received. I'm sure we won't be disappointed, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference.
So we thought we would build in here just a few minutes where people can now make any comments they want about what they've heard so far, either elements of issues to do with the landscape, things you want to add to it, comments or questions to Annalisa, or ideas people have about the framing as it's been sketched by Philipp and Kevin. So the aim is to let everyone weigh in on absolutely anything, and then in a few minutes we'll turn to Martin. I should maybe add that the Institute for International Law and Justice here at NYU, is, for those who haven't run into this, has been very focused on the global municipal law ideas that Philipp introduced. So the room is perhaps disproportionately populated with people who are either paid up in practicing parts of that or at least critically engaged with it. So you met several of them. One of them, though, is my colleague Dick Stewart, who's here. He's also worked a lot on climate finance and governance elements of the prospective climate change regime. So I think we've had a project in that area. Also, there are been other substantial groups around the world, especially in the North Atlantic, working on global municipal law in a systematic way. One based in Rome, and Lorenzo Cassini is here as a kind of flag-waving member of that enterprise. And in Geneva, Laurence Poisson-de has worked on this, and with us, who's also here, worked a lot on international organizations through that lens. There's also a substantial group in Heidelberg, Max Planck, which is the original spawning ground of the Philipp Dann enterprise, and Matthias Goldmann is here from there, and others. So I just want to mention that part of it. And I think one further element, which hasn't quite come out in the way we've opened this so far, is the perspective of people in developing countries or trying to work from that side of it, and that is not as represented as ideally would be in this conference, but we have a number of people from, particularly from Brazil and from Indonesia, Argentina, some other countries, and other people who are working closely with scholars in those groups. And I think that's a very important part of the changing landscape, is the changing of the voices and the framing of the problems. And that's something we've also done a lot on in the global municipal law work, or at least tried to. So with that, we now invite everybody to weigh in who would like to for a few minutes. So wave your hand if you want to say something. Yes, please. I can't see very well. Could you introduce yourself as well?
Ronnie Mullen. I'm at the College of William and Mary and currently based in India at the Center for Policy Research. I just wanted to bring up an issue to the first presentation. You had mentioned this issue of trends in the aid delivery and what is driving some of these trends being an increased concern for value for money. But I think maybe we should also think about what we mean by value, right? What are we really saying? Is it really about aid impact? Or is it, when we look at the discussion currently in the US, where USAID and other organizations were trying to untie some aid, food aid, for example, there's a huge outcry. We all know tied aid is less effective than untied, and yet the delivery mechanisms and what we view as value for results might be different from people who sit in international organizations versus the domestic constituencies that finance these and in an environment of constrained resources want to not have aid untied. Thanks.
A reply for you. Oh, thank you very much, Ronnie. Actually, you raised quite an important point. On the value for money, it's I think a big topic within DFID. It's also the way it frames, it's framing our work at the moment. But I would like to kind of raise a point. You might have seen, if you had a look at the background paper, we tried to look into the partner country perspective. So what does value for money, what are the kind of principles or priorities for the type of aid developing countries would like to receive? We consider just 3 countries, Ethiopia, Cambodia, and Zambia. And I just would like to make this point around untying aid. It might kind of look a bit kind of tough, or at least going against the Paris Declaration principle, but so far we haven't found any kind of particular interest or any particular problem from these countries about having aid untied or untied, tied or untied. And when we kind of ask about these questions to government officials, we're trying to have a sort of neutral approach to the Paris Declaration. So we ask them what they think they are the priorities when it comes to the terms of conditions of aid flows. They mentioned the usual suspects, ownership, alignment, and others, but none of them has mentioned untied aid. So that's something when we're kind of thinking about this debate and value for money and the perspective of what we think results mean, we need to take into account what developing countries think is also about results. In the case, for instance, and this is probably the UK modus operandi I'm more familiar with, value for money is really just getting the most out of the money they have, but in terms of having cheaper inputs and a more efficient use of resources. And I have to say, even in the way we need to kind of justify our theory of change and the effectiveness of our work, also for a research institute, it becomes quite challenging sometimes. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I would like also to kind of stress the fact that when we're talking about result-based aid, we also need to talk about what this means from the partner country perspective as well.
Yes, John.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you. First, let me present myself so people in the room will have a context of where I'm coming from. My name is Jean Touchette, and I'm with the Development Finance and Statistics Division of the OECD, more particularly the Development Cooperation Directorate, which is the DAC Secretariat, in fact. And obviously, all my comments will be on Annalisa's excellent presentation. And I particularly wanted to say that the presentation of the landscape is very good, and indeed the picture is getting more and more complicated. And speaking of innovation, it is a fact that DAC members have been, and the DAC statistical system has had trouble keeping up for various reasons. Why? Well, first of all, ODA was the standard for so long. We came up with ODA and the concept of ODA in the 1970s, and there was so much emphasis on the 0.7 target. It still is considered a sacred cow in many quarters. The OECD is governed by consensus, and hopefully there are not too many statisticians here, but statisticians, I think, are inherently conservative. So things haven't kept up. I also liked very much the review of the factors affecting ODA, and I find that sobering because, and a bit sad in a sense, because in going over the factors, I feel that all the aid effectiveness principles, which have come out of 50 years of development cooperation, are being evacuated. Aid effectiveness principles came about because we've made mistakes in the past, and the key principles of country ownership, etc., harmonization and alignment with country systems. It feels that we're not talking about this anymore. On this issue of results, for example, I mean, yes, one question that I will ask is: are we looking for the right results? Are politicians in DAC member countries looking for the right results? It's good to have kids in school, but how long will they be in school? It's good to build schools, it's good to build health clinics, etc., etc. But are these going to be sustained over the long term? So we can argue that the activities showing the concrete results are in fact the least transformative. Speaking of commercial and foreign policy objectives, yes, that is true, and I think it's always been true of DAC donors. But how about emerging donors? Are they being innovative, or are they replicating the mistakes that we DAC donors did during the last 50 years on tying up our aid? Risk aversion. Why is general budget support no longer the flavor of the month? That I'm a bit sad about that, because I've been, I was in Tanzania for 3 years, and there was about $850 million worth of general budget support to Tanzania every year. And DFID was the biggest donor with 150 million pounds every year, and that was the preferred modality of the Tanzanian government. So my question is, what are the recipient governments doing about that? South-South cooperation principles, coming back with what I'll tie this with commercial and foreign policy objectives. The principles, as you have presented them, look very good, but are they really the reality? Do emerging donors also have political and geostrategic interests? If you take the example of India, who has a program of cooperation with Nepal, are there any foreign policy and commercial interests there? You could answer that. You know, I'm just worried that with the new emerging donors, are we not putting them up on a pedestal? Just a question. But however, their emphasis on growth and infrastructure is really welcome. And they do represent good competition for DAC members, speaking of competition. As I mentioned, the ODA concept is too rigid. You know, ODA has very precise criteria. There has to be certain flow types. There has to be an official source, the destination. There's a DAC list of eligible recipients, which includes countries like China, Indonesia. Do we need to keep such a list? There has to be a development and welfare purpose, and there has to be a very strict concessionality criteria, which basically says that a loan has to have at least 25% of a grant element. And in fact, yes, the ODA concept dates back from the 70s, but it's been corrupted in a sense over the years because DAC members have added in some expenditures which are not really flows and which are called phantom aid in a sense, refugee costs, imputed student costs. Among DAC members recently, there has been an effort. In fact, the DAC members have asked the Secretariat to come up with a new measure of total official support of development, because there is a sense that the ODA concept needs to be modernized. But this calls into question many issues. When you are looking at a measure of total official support for development, when you're looking at the budgetary expenditures of a country for development, that calls into question many issues. Where does development start and where does it end? Do you only look at budgetary expenditures that have a development intent, or do you look at those that have a development impact? Not at all the same thing. How do you account for global public goods like adaptation and mitigation of climate finance, or a stable security situation? That is a global public good. In the case of security assistance, the DAC members have drawn a very specific line. There are some security expenditures that are in and some that are out. But you will have people that will argue that, for example, the French intervention in Mali has a development impact and could be counted as a budgetary effort towards development. That has been thrown on the table before. In the case of climate finance, it's true we cannot separate aid activities from climate finance activities. And yes, most of the budgets for climate finance adaptation and mitigation come from ODA. So I'll stop it there. I mean, I've got a whole list of questions, but I'll stop it there to leave the place to leave the space for other people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dann. Just an aside, I changed the side of the channel. I was with the OECD before joining ODI, so and a development cluster. So thank you very much for your thought-provoking comments, and probably we might have sort of discussion during the conference. And probably I would like to stress a couple of points. Yes, the ODA definition has been kind of challenged recently, but I understand there will be discussion that will probably lead to a revision after 2015, after the kind of negotiation. So having a sort of couple of measurement from the donor side and from the recipient side. So this is very much welcome in terms of description and also in the measurement of global public goods. As I was mentioning, this was going to be probably one of our work stream at ODI, just to understand a bit more the kind of share of ODA which is targeted towards climate finance. And this is a particular kind of complicated topic because of blended finance and the role of the private sector as well. In terms of budget support and the kind of perception of recipient countries, still kind of linking to the kind of partner perspective that I haven't brought that much in the presentation. Yes, it's still the kind of, most welcome modality, at least in the countries we surveyed. But some of them, they're trying really to leverage on other sources of development finance. And the fact, for instance, and this is quite important on the point about competition among actors, the fact there are other actors at the table, or at least in the development finance landscape, is making some partner countries stronger when it comes to negotiations. So in the sense, the presence of non-DAC donors as a kind of providers of development finance is making, for instance, countries like Cambodia and Ethiopia more assertive in the way they kind of negotiate with DAC donors. They're stronger. Of course, we're talking also about countries like Ethiopia and Cambodia with strong governments and in terms of very strong geopolitical role if we compare to other countries, for instance, like Zambia. Yes, I mean, non-DAC donors have motives that kind of resemble the kind of modus operandi of traditional DAC donors in the past, but it's a kind of varied approach. If I think about the kind of modus operandi of China in Africa, I mean, we have diplomatic reasons, we have commercial reasons, we have linked, for instance, to resource-rich countries and exploitation of mineral resources. So it's a very kind of varied mode, and it's difficult to kind of generalize it over the entire continent. But I think there will be a session later on talking about the non-DAC donors and their mode of intervention in the countries. Yep.
Well, thank you very much. So I think we can now hear a different perspective on innovation and law, and invite Martin Eifert to present his very stimulating paper, and after that we'll have a bit of discussion, and then that'll lead to the coffee break. So Martin, welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Innovation has become sort of a magic word for modern societies. Its connotations of creativity and progress embrace many of the aspirations of modern society and carry its fundamental belief that nowadays problems can be solved by future developments. In development finance, innovation characterizes both the technical aspect of and the idea of innovation. On the technical side, there are the instruments as such and the transformation of the system, which has to cope with a new plurality of instruments. But the language of many articles reflects also the far-reaching hopes concerning the problem-solving capacity of innovations. If innovation has become something magic in modern times, research on innovation is an attempt to transform the magic into something manageable. I would like to examine whether and how general research on innovation can be helpful for the discussion on innovation in development finance. The approach already indicates that I'm not an expert in development law per se, but rather in public law in general and in law and innovation in particular. Therefore, my role in this conference might be more what had been called the king's jester in former times. I do not wear a fool's cap, and I appreciate that, but as it had been with the jester in former times, it may not be clear whether my observations as an outsider are helpful observations or just foolish. Anyway, I will proceed in two steps. First, I will briefly highlight the approaches and crucial points in the development of general innovation theory. And against this background, I will subsequently turn to development finance and will make some observations. My general claim will be that while there's a large volume on research on innovation, and also on the role law might play, the concept innovation has remained largely connected to market processes and remains rather external to law. With regard to law and innovation development finance, my suspicion is that innovation policy may be applied to instruments that open up new markets, and that an overall governance approach should not interfere with innovative developments, but rather make the public sector responsive to the dynamics. Let me start with the perspectives on innovation. The starting point of current research on innovation is still Josef Schumpeter, an Austrian economist and social scientist in the first decades of the 20th century. He coined a still valid definition, and he shaped the notion of the generic processes of innovation. According to Schumpeter's early work in 1912, innovation is the new combination of resources in business, ranging from new markets to changes in the value chain, from new products to new methods of production or new ways to organize business. The new combination of resources is considered an innovation as soon as it is commercialized, which means that it is preceded by an invention and prototypes, and it is succeeded by the diffusion on the market at the final stage of the innovation process. This broad understanding that was formulated at the outset of innovation theory got lost when innovation theory became a rising star in the second half of the last century. At this time, the focus was very much narrowed to product and process innovations, which are driven by technological innovations. Among the various aspects and approaches to technological innovation, the notion of technical regimes and trajectories became crucial. Roughly summarized, an early concept suggests that the mindset of technicians doing research and development is the pivotal selection mechanism of technological options at an early stage. Market and cultural influences become selective at later stages, and they create feedback loops to the regime at the early stage. Such processes sum up to a technological paradigm which channels attention and problem-solving capacities in line with the once chosen technology. Generally speaking, the concept highlights the importance of cognitive settings, professional self-conception, and the force of positive feedback mechanisms in the course of time. The concept is a major source for what nowadays is called a path dependency in many fields of research. A third understanding of innovation has to be mentioned, and that's the concept of innovation systems. It takes into account the relevance of much more societal and political factors, and they have been included in the analysis and have led to this kind of perspective on innovation systems as a whole. The focus shifted to institutional links, the institutional links between science as a source of invention, the emerging technologies, and their diffusion as innovations. This perspective highlights the entire set of public policies that relate to innovation, from state aid for research at universities to public support for market entry and the diffusion of key technologies, from intellectual property law to state-supported incubators for new firms. Furthermore, once recursive effects have attracted attention and some client-oriented models of business became popular, the importance of learning by doing and the market interaction was increasingly stressed. This perspective puts emphasis on the interaction in segmented value chains and the importance and development of tacit knowledge and competence in the firm. Eventually, research on innovation systems proceeded to grasp the whole picture. Lundvall and others have recently proposed a definition which is so comprehensive that I rather skip the quote. This concept, however, is so broad that it does not provide for more than generic statements, and it will probably just evoke a persistent claim for differentiation. It's symptomatic that I referred to crucial concepts and did not try to apply any kind of methodology of innovation research. Innovation research is a notorious interdisciplinary rebel. There isn't such a thing like methodology of innovation research. Having said that, it should be noted, however, that innovation research basically is confined to innovations by enterprises on economic markets, even though it takes all kinds of societal factors into consideration that are related to that. At this point, law comes into play. Law matters in almost every aspect of innovation, unavoidably and in many different ways. Freedom of inventors are guaranteed by constitutional rights. The definition of property rights for inventions strikes the balance between appropriation and adequate availability for competitors. Competition law usually exempts corporations that facilitate innovations. and the entire innovation system is shaped by means of law. Jurisprudence has also discovered innovation, since it deals with every aspect that is relevant to society. And we can identify 3 roles of law with regard to innovation. First, it should keep society open for innovation. Second, law should prevent unacceptable risks of innovations. And third, law is often used to help instigate innovations in order to tackle specific problems. I will briefly outline the 2 last mentioned roles. Prevention of unacceptable risks starts with adequate mechanisms that ensure compliance with legal requirements. The challenge, however, is to cope with uncertainty. Risk management in face of uncertainty has primarily been developed in environmental law. We observe a framework of risk management, risk assessment, and continuous monitoring, which reflects the needs of a society subjecting itself to experimentation. Sophisticated procedural arrangements, flexible rules, and adjustability of decisions to new findings dominate law in this field. Instigating or channeling innovations in order to achieve political goals is very widespread. We can see a multitude of instruments, but they all have one thing in common. They use economic competition as a basic driver for innovation. They initiate markets for innovative products, they reward innovators, or they penalize laggards. In any case, they influence private behavior on a market, but basically rely on an economic self-interest as a motivation to discover the best solution. Insofar, law has accepted Hayek's claim, which says, dispersed information spread throughout society can be best exploited by the market, and the state should not presume to have enough knowledge to find a better solution. It's important to distinguish this research on innovation-related law from innovations in law. Of course, legal rules, procedures, and arrangements can be described as a range of products undergoing processes of innovation. However, lawmaking is subject to economic competition only to a very limited extent, and the lawmaking process is very different from the private market. Its sources are either consent, in case of contracts, or democratic legitimacy, in case of statutes. I hope we can avoid the sort of cliche that we are coming from American enthusiasm to European skepticism, but there might be some differences in our perspectives on innovation. Turning to development finance against this background, we can easily notice that this field is far more complex than technological innovation in other fields. The main difference seems to be the heterogeneity of actors and driving forces as compared to commercial firms on an economic market. However, we can at least use basic ideas of innovation research as a focusing device for our look at innovation in development finance. Basic parameters of any framework for innovation are the driving forces and the mechanisms of selection. Therefore, I will start my comment along these mechanisms: the public sector, philanthropic donations as a market of empathy, and market relations. As far as the public sector is concerned, we may first of all ask whether the concept of innovation, or rather the concept of reform, is a better framework for analysis. The boundaries of these concepts are blurred, but reform stands rather for a comprehensive change along politically defined lines, whereas innovation is something new that was neither planned in detail before its emergence, nor been part of an overall plan. The new instruments are probably to be analyzed on a case-to-case basis. Independent of this semantic dispute, all innovations in development finance in the public sector are subject to public accountability. And public accountability appears to be the driver of many innovations. If we understand the long-standing call for effectiveness as a result of a public demand to legitimize public spending, many of the innovative instruments can be seen as a shortcut to solve the problem and to tap new sources. Instruments such as the air ticket solidarity levy or revenue streams in the framework of the emission trading scheme go back to intuitive notions of responsibility. They link the financial burden to situations in which the widely accepted correlation of privilege and responsibility can be invoked. The use of physical mobility points at a life on the sunny side of globalization, and emission trading mechanisms not only invoke the responsibility for the public good, but also remind that the climate change is a legacy of what made us developed countries. The so-called double dividend also illustrates the connectivity. The dark side, however, may be an erosion of traditional forms of ODA, which can hardly rely on a similar self-evident context, even in case of effective and perfectly monitored projects. Besides public accountability, competition may also be seen as a driver for innovation in the public sector. However, as far as it is competition on a market of political support, it goes back to public accountability. As far as it is economic competition, such as on the capital market, there is no difference to private activity, but it raises the question to what extent the public sector should be marketized. Concerning philanthropic donors, the selection is entirely dependent on their preferences. There seems to be a sort of market of empathy which is strongly related to image gains on this market for corporate actors. And on this market, health seems to outweigh by far any other interest. Thus, the innovative instruments very much stick to a very traditional field of charity. It seems to be worthwhile to analyze whether this is unavoidable or at least partly just path dependency. A third strand of instruments is market-based. It reflects both an increased interest in developing countries as economic partners by the private sector and a rising recourse to capital market instruments by all sectors. All these approaches share the interest in opening up new markets. Therefore, the whole set of policy instruments designed to overcome obstacles for innovation in market entry or diffusion can be applied. Public funding of basic infrastructure can pave the way. Initial funding reduces the risk of stranded costs. Framework of cooperation lower transaction costs. And additional funding can trigger investments which would have otherwise fall short of profitability. The entire array is applicable as well for direct investments as it is for financial instruments. In any event, all instruments for opening up new markets must be compatible with the market as such. There's always a very strong temptation for an ongoing expansion of the instruments in order to move the market towards directions that are politically desired. Numerous failed attempts of state promotion of particular technologies demonstrate, however, that this does not work at all. Any sustainable approach should be based on realistic and lasting market assessments and should be tested against them over and over again in the course of time. We can also recognize, and Annalisa told us a lot about these mechanisms, that are more and more blending mechanisms. So I can skip this part. I would just like to highlight that the blending mechanisms more and more move the market of innovative instruments towards an economic of attention. And the phenomenon you just mentioned, that some innovations just want to be the new kid on the block, just shows us that the market of the economics of market attention get more and more important because this, that's my suggestion, should not be analyzed in the framework of innovation, but rather in the framework of economics of attention. In sum, even there are common underlying tendencies, drivers and mechanisms of innovation differ in the various fields. But does that mean that we cannot talk about development as a project anymore and only about projects in development? I would like to scrutinize briefly the status of the discourse and will afterwards point at the basic options for governance. Looking from outside, I have the impression that innovation in finance has not only technically multiplied the sources and actors, but also shaped the perception of a dawn of a new era. The documents are replete with language that evokes a fundamental change in the system. This sounds very much like a new paradigm. However, once the notion of development finance has changed, path dependency might not allow to return to former concepts. All actors might expect the other players to continue, and as much as we expect the success of innovative financing in the global discourse, be it on the basis of rational analysis, be it on the basis of hope, to that extent we risk becoming dependent on it. This, in turn, is risky if we look at the unclear results that have been delivered thus far. Be that as it may, current developments definitely challenge the governance of development finance. If we do not dismiss the idea of coherence altogether, we have the choice between two approaches, a more modest one that attempts to manage the interplay and a very ambitious one that attempts to coordinate plurality. Support of developing countries seems to be far too important for trial and error and far too complex to be put into effect through myriads of individual projects. Even the concept note of this conference seems to reflect some desire for a holistic concept which suggests cooperation. In research on innovation, in fact, it is sometimes stressed that systemic tasks require planning rather than unfettered innovation. However, any kind of coordination needs a superior authority and a comprehensive framework for negotiation. To me, neither seems to be very realistic in development finance. The more realistic, modest approach would not aim at integrating the various innovative instruments. It would not interfere with the innovative processes, but rather try to manage the interplay. The aim would not be maximizing overall efficiency, but merely avoidance of dysfunctionality and extreme shortfalls. In other words, innovation in the private sector would be seen as a process of trial and error to be left alone in order to find out what is best. But public institutions should be responsive to the development and redefine their tasks in order to allow for a productive interplay. The paramount instrument in such a governance scheme should be information on what is needed and done. Public institutions should further enlarge their role as an information hub and build databases, registers, and networks of information. But ODA should also be sensitive to the new financial streams and should routinely reflect its approach in the context of concurring initiatives. On a case-to-case basis, public institutions should decide whether they support already existing or likely private initiatives, or whether they confine themselves to sectors and countries which are not served by other players. Thus, fragmentation should be at least partially turned into deliberate segmentation. Additionally, knowledge management might also spur further innovation. Public-private partnerships, for instance, had been established in administrative law for a long time before they arrived in development finance. So the potential for imitation has probably not been fully exploited. This approach of managing the interplay is deeply pragmatic. You could also call it just well-informed muddling through. In sum, the picture I've sketched is ambiguous. It seems to make sense to analyze aspects of the current developments in terms of innovation. Path dependency may warn against irreversible reliance on innovative instruments. Focusing on drivers may help identify the scope for innovative instruments. It may give, in some cases, advice for public policy. The best field for applying experience from innovation research is the opening up of new markets. Eventually, the concept of innovation suggests that the governance structure should focus on mechanisms to keep all actors informed and to make public actors responsive to the change. But taken as a whole, innovation in development finance just seems to be too innovative for innovation research. Thank you very much.
So we have a few minutes for comments. I'm resisting the urge to respond immediately. Matthias.
I'm trying to... Okay, sorry, Matthias Goldman from the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg. Thank you very much for this extremely inspiring talk. Nevertheless, I'm trying to challenge you a little bit on the almost cliche notion that law is not as innovative as other sectors of society, if I understood that correctly, because law depends on consent or depends on political processes. I would like to suggest that it's really important to look at what at different fields of law, because on the one hand there's public law, and that necessarily depends on parliaments, and that's a very heavy and burdensome process. But I think there's the innovative part of the law, and that is private law. And I think that there's history is full of innovations in private law, so maybe, for example, the design of new company structures, like the limited company, that had been a worldwide success, just to give one example. So maybe if we would like to look into the question of innovation in law, we would have to observe shifts from private law to public law. To what extent becomes something that develops and emerges in private law of concern for public institutions, they want to get it under control, or they want to promote it, and things like this. So I think there's a lot of processes on the public-private divide going on that relate to innovation.
Thanks very much for the challenge. Well, the short answer is I'm a public lawyer, but that's not the problem. I think I totally agree with you, and you're in line with Kevin, that the private law sector is much more innovative than the public one. But I think in the private law sector, the law is shaped by other drivers. So it's not law as such that is innovative. It's not law that drives the innovation. It's just a law that is at the hands of the actors. And so the law is shaped by needs that come from other sectors. And therefore, law is not the driver, even though there are a lot of innovations in law.
Martin, I guess I have to ask two questions. Because it seems to me that you've offered perspectives on both the theory of innovation and then on development finance and how it might relate to that theory. And I wonder if in each case the vision might be a little too narrow. First of all, in terms of innovation theory, perhaps this is in the theory of innovation systems that you glossed over quite quickly, but it seems to me that it's not all focused on innovation by market actors. I mean, a lot of that work seems to be about the role of not only market actors, but the state and universities, which are not-for-profit institutions, and then perhaps even other types of not-for-profit institutions and how they interact in generating innovation. So, including the scientific community more generally, not necessarily located in universities. So I guess it seems to me that theories that incorporate that diversity of actors might potentially be applicable in the kinds of settings that we're talking about, which, as you say, are populated by a more heterogeneous group of actors. So that was the first comment. And then the second comment was about your picture of the development finance landscape, which you divided or segmented into these neat categories of public, the private or market types, and the not-for-profit ones or philanthropic ones. And again, I wonder if the reality of what we're seeing is more complex than that. You, again, sort of glossed over the cases of blending and mutation, which I think are actually not just at the periphery and in the small category of innovative finance, but actually right at the core of what we're seeing in some respects. So in terms of the private actors, you say, well, they're motivated by competition and economic considerations. The public actors are motivated by political goals and accountability. The philanthropic ones are motivated by just their preferences. But I think the situation is actually a little more complicated than that. Some of the private actors, say the project finance banks, are appearing or acting as though they're motivated by concerns about legitimacy and accountability by opening themselves up to the kinds of grievance mechanisms that are required by the Equator Principles. Public actors certainly are motivated by economic considerations. I mean, a lot of these development banks actually are banks, and they're disciplined by their bondholders, so they have to actually deliver a certain minimal level of economic return. So I think economic factors are driving the innovation there. And then as for the philanthropic actors, they're increasingly becoming involved in things like social impact investment, where it's not just about achieving some philanthropic goal, but also maintaining, again, or achieving a certain level of economic return. And so I'm just wondering if you're as pessimistic about the prospects for innovation theory in explaining or analyzing those phenomena, the blending and the mutation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Let me talk about the public policies on innovation that are invoked by this strand of research that is in innovation systems. What you were referring to is what they call the science, technology, and innovation mode, which basically means they are looking at the institutional links between science, technology, emerging technologies, and the innovations as they emerge on the market. And of course, there's a lot of research on what the state can do. And I said, well, I think this is the part that can be most easily be transferred to where we look at opening up new markets in development finance. Because this is just about lowering transaction costs by, for instance, providing clauses for contracts or something like that. And there are a lot of things going on. But that's basically just the traditional set of policies that try to overcome these obstacles of market entry. I totally agree with you that this is a transferable point. And I said, well, basic infrastructure paved the way. Additional financing can just make the additional share that makes an investment profitable. And so all these instruments can be applied. The other point are blended mechanisms of finance. Well, the point I would like to raise is that these blended instruments very much depend on low transaction costs, because public actors pair with private actors, and so you have a lot of actors that agree upon one project. And the problem is that this project-oriented approach can be even more accelerated by using the internet, as it lowers transaction costs even more. And the more transaction costs are less decisive, the more attention of the actors becomes important. And that was my point, that development finance more and more goes into the direction of economics of attention. So I completely agree with you that blended mechanisms are very important, but they depend on the low transaction costs, which basically means they are limited to very concrete projects, and this just puts the whole instrument into another context, the economics of attention.
Just one short remark. I actually have to say that I like this typology a lot, and I would defend Martin in this respect, that obviously a typology, I mean splitting up public, philanthropic and market-based mechanism is a typology. It doesn't mean to sort of grasp the whole complexity of reality, but to give us certain sort of perspectives and sort of describe certain main logics or main sort of mechanisms. And then in that sense, I find this really helpful, and I would be really curious during the next 1.5 days to see, as we go through these different mechanisms in this conference, to see whether his predictions actually sort of prove to be true or sort of not. I would so in that sense, I think it's a helpful kind of clearing of the field. But I would challenge you a little bit on the first sector, the public sector, because I think if I understood you correctly, first you said the thing here is it doesn't operate in the logic of a market, because the logic of political law reform is one based on accountability or on consent in contracts. But what I didn't quite get is the dark side of the possibility of marketizing or sort of turning this public sector in a more market-driven kind of area. And here I would say, wouldn't it be good if public lenders, public funding agencies would find themselves in a more market-driven kind of environment, and wouldn't that help to make them more sort of open up to new ideas and drive them? So where would you say where would you sort of see the dark sides of this kind of marketizing of the public field?
Well, we could observe this at the national level before, because more and more public enterprises became subject to economic mechanisms. And one of the major problems always has been what the appropriate governance structure would be like. So how are they to be organized so that they can match a public accountability that comes from the public side and economic forces that come from the market side? And most of the organizations are simply not shaped to be really successful in this kind of market unless they undergo an organizational reform. And so this very much just shifts the focus from the outcome of the enterprises to how they are organized internally. And this is the dark side, that first you have to be organized in a way that allows you to match these two concurring mechanisms before you can be successful.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's actually time for our break, so why don't we break for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back at 11 for the session on the World Bank and its innovations in financing instruments.